Fainting spells, frilly white dresses, an eerie sense of mystery, and a truly Australian backdrop. Joan Lindsay's Picnic at Hanging Rock is 50 years old this year, and for many, it's a cultural obsession.
What we see and what we seem are but a dream within a dream. You must learn to love someone else. I won't be here much longer.
Once again, let me remind you, the rock itself is extremely dangerous.
Miranda!
3 of your young ladies and Miss McCraw are missing on the rock.
This is Big Ideas. I'm Paul Barclay. Miranda and her friends go missing at Hanging Rock, never to be found again. The story is fictional, but Hanging Rock is real. A volcanic outcrop only 70 kilometres north of Melbourne, and a rock of special spiritual significance to local Indigenous people. The mystery around this geological formation too is real. Clocks stop working. People lose all sense of time. Indigenous visitors balk at climbing the rock because it feels evil. Lindsay's eerie tale has inspired a film, a radio play, stage adaptations, fashion spreads, music videos, and a new mini-series coming out this year. Why do we keep coming back to this story of a Valentine's Day school picnic gone wrong? Perhaps it's the striking combinations of imagery or the maddening obscurity of the ending. Let's hear from actress Helen Morse, who played the French teacher in Peter Weir's film of Picnic at Hanging Rock. Author Janelle McCulloch, who's written a biography of Joan Lindsay called Beyond the Rock, and Tom Wright, who adapted the novel for the stage for the Malthouse Theatre. They're in conversation with the programming manager at the Wheeler Centre, Helen Withercombe.
I struggle to find out why this book, this story, continues to engage audience like this 50 years on. Do you have any thoughts about why that might be?
Well, I mean, I'm not a critic of authors, but I know when I first read the book, which was actually in the late 60s, I couldn't stop. And it's something to do with, I remember thinking that it was like a jewel. It just had its own facets and construction. And I didn't even think that like that. I thought it was so exquisitely written, it just took me with it. And maybe that has something to do with it. And of course, all the aspects of it, like the mystery. I think one thing that resonates always for all time, and probably will for all time, is that central idea of we Europeans in an ancient landscape and the tensions and the conflicts that arise from that and what meaning lies underneath that.
Tom, is that something that you looked into when you were researching your play?
And if I hadn't looked into it, it certainly would have thrust itself upon me. I think the answer to the question of why the Lindsay text and why the Peter Weir film have come to be so iconic and why they're so widespread in our culture goes directly to what Helen was just speaking about, is that it's become a text, whether Lindsay wished it to be or not, a text of wide anxiety about the post-colonial experience, but also a great proto-feminist text. I'm not trying to claim it as a feminist text, but a proto-feminist text in a way, because the way in which it centralises female experience via the landscape. And there's that wonderful moment in the novel where Irma remarks, whoever invented corsets for the Australian landscape in the year 1900 must have been insane. And you realise that Lindsay is speaking on behalf of modern women, talking about her own grandparents' generation and about the way in which clothes, sexuality, landscape and legitimacy all intersect in a text which doesn't seek to wag its finger at you, but rather presents itself as the unfolding of a dream. And so that it's wonderful that you acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and the way in which the Kulin people appropriate their own stories and refract them and transmogrify them through time, because that, in our very modest and paltry way, is exactly what white Australia is starting to do with the rock. It's a site of transformation. It's a liminal space where we move from myth into culture and back into myth again. And just as generations of young Wurundjeri people and other Kulin people, young people were taken up there as children and came back down as adults, Lindsay, in her own way, how knowing she was, I don't know, created a text where the occupying forces, young, went up the rock, and if they did come back down, they certainly didn't come back down in a way we recognised them.
And Janelle, what was it that drew you to the book?
I think it's a portrait of Australia. I think it's a love song to Australia. Joan Lindsay really wanted to write the great Australian novel, but she also wanted to write something that represented Australia and the Australia that she loved and that she was so passionate about. And that's why it resonates 50 years on. That's why we're all here today, is that it means so much to all of us. The landscape, the characters. We identify with so many things in that novel. It really is a poem to Australia, about Australia.
She was a pretty interesting character. Could you talk a
Joan
little
Lindsay?
bit about Joan Lindsay?
Yeah.
Yes, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about her background.
She was very enigmatic. She loved a mystery. She was herself a mystery. And in fact, there was a letter from one of her friends that's in her archives in the State Library next door, and he writes, I think there is a great deal in this letter, but I'm not quite sure what it is. So she would even hide things in her letters. She was a mystic. She clearly had an ability to see things in the landscape, much like some of the Indigenous Australians can do, to see things that we can't. And lots of people talked about that. Peter Weir and her housekeeper and the people who knew her said she certainly had an ability to see things. She was a very complex woman. She had come from a very wealthy Edwardian, upper-class Edwardian family, but she had said when she was 12 that she wanted to marry a Lindsay. The Lindsay family were well known even back then. She'd set her sights on Norman Lindsay, but he probably didn't even know she existed. So she turned around one day, she was studying art under Frederick McCubbin, and she saw Darryl Lindsay walking through. He'd just come back off the war. He was very tall, very handsome, looked like a Hollywood film star. And she said, I'm going to marry him. And they eloped in London.
Oh, wow.
And Dame Elizabeth Murdoch said it sent out ripples for a long, long time because Joan had come from the establishment, and Darryl Lindsay, of course, had come from an artistic bohemian family. But Joan identified more with the Charleston, the Bloomsbury group and the Charleston set. So she didn't mind at all. But that one decision, marrying Darryl Lindsay, changed her whole life because she then, they were poor for quite a lot of their life. And in fact, I think that's probably what propelled her to write this great novel because, they needed a little bit of money. But she also wanted to do something to write a bit of a swan song, I think. But she lived a very complex life. I mean, you think that John and Sunday Reid, their life out at Heidi was complex. Mulberry Hill was far more complex, but they were very discreet at Mulberry Hill, and that's the difference between Joan and Darryl and between John and Sunday Reid. Joan and Darryl were very discreet and very dignified people. They were very social. They had a lot of well-known friends. Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh would go and stay with them, and prime ministers, and they had a lot of political friends. But Joan was very shy. Dame Elizabeth Murdoch told a story when Joan was visiting Dame Elizabeth Murdoch and a visitor knocked on the door and Jane hid behind a curtain because she didn't want to sort of see anyone. So she was a very shy person by nature as well.
Helen, what are your memories? You must have met Joan on set.
I did meet her. She came to Hanging Rock, actually, when we were filming there. We filmed there initially for about 2 weeks before we went to South Australia. And I know that probably everybody's heard Anne Lambert's story about her having just been a bit troubled by a scene she'd been involved in, and she was wandering around at the base of the rock, and she saw this rather frail-looking woman coming towards her, who then just sort of threw her arms around her and said, "Oh, Miranda, it's been so long." And
incredible.
I didn't have quite that experience, but she did spot me, and I was trying to breathe with a corset on and everything else because we were filming in the middle of summer and it was very, very hot. And I was finding some shade under a tree, and I turned around and I saw, again, this woman coming towards me, and she said, "Bonjour, mademoiselle." And so we then exchanged a few words in French. Hers was perfect. And then we had a conversation, and I had the strange experience that she was talking to me, and she did make some references to... I'd worked with Cliff Green before, who wrote the screenplay adapted from the book. And Cliff had written a television series for the ABC, a 4-part series, based on his own experiences as a country school teacher called Marion. Well, Joan was absolutely... She was a little bit... not obsessed, but that kind of detail really interested her. The fact that I had played Marion, and Marion was one of the characters in the book, and that now I was playing Mademoiselle, and I also spoke a bit of French.
Oh, gosh, it was like it was meant to be.
But she was wonderful. But she did kind of look, it was a curious thing. She did look at you and talk to you, but I did get the impression every now and then that she was sort of seeing, I don't know, the world of her book somehow. That I was not just the actress playing the character. Through me, she was seeing her own Mademoiselle somehow.
And before you were part of the film, you'd actually been approached to do the stage play version, is that right?
Well, yes. Too late, sadly, Tom. I was a student with Jim Sharman, and I think he was probably one of the first people to read the book when it was published in 1967. And he was very keen. We'd worked together a couple of times, and he came to me and said, "Oh, you must read this book." I did. And he said, I want to adapt it for the theatre. But it didn't eventuate. And I was going to play Sarah.
God, that would have been completely different. How did you tackle taking it to the stage, Tom? It's a big story, and as we said before, landscape is a massive part of it. How did you get that landscape into a stage?
Well, you can't except through language, and that was kind of the offering that Lindsay herself makes, is that her language is not just cinematic. We sort of understand that. She also had a great eye for detail, and when she chooses to describe the millipedes or the way in which spiders hide under bark, you realise that she's seeing and describing landscape in miniature as well as in a sort of a maximum panoscope. And at that point I realised, well, if it's an act of storytelling and it's pointless to try and avoid that. It would be ridiculous to try to reduce a text like Picnic at Hanging Rock down to a naturalistic 5-act play, or to try and deny Lindsay her more mystic sort of qualities. And so I made it into an act of narration as much as an act of anything else. It became a piece where contemporary schoolgirls in contemporary private school uniforms, as if creatures out of a Charles Blackman painting, found themselves possessed, to use a Lindsay-esque term, possessed by preceding generations, and telling the story, telling what it was like, as if we're caught in a cycle of endless return. So a difficult text, it should be said, and a very wordy one. I tried very hard to stay true to the spirit and the dreaming quality that Lindsay evokes.
One of the things I loved about your play was that you'd removed, for the most part, the white dresses and gone for a contemporary school uniform, which gave a sense of timelessness. Was that a conscious decision? One
of the problems that we hit with cultural forms is that at a certain point, particularly in cinema and television, is that what is yesterday's bold design offer becomes tomorrow's cultural cliche. And so those panpipes that we entered the stage to were actually a beautiful and evocative piece of sound design, but now they've almost become a cliche. And I remember when I was at the Rock a few years ago, there was a tour group of young Korean women who were there, all yelling out Miranda, Miranda to each other as they went up and down. And it made me, and some were dressed and some had parasols. They would come with their thematic costumes. And it made me realise that at a certain point, no matter what is, as I said, is one day a bold and interesting design decision where you feel like you're, to use Jonathan Miller's term, breaking bread with the dead, suddenly at a certain point just becomes fashion. And so for a contemporary stage adaptation to appropriate those Edwardian white school dresses and the beautiful detail that was achieved by the design team on the film in the 70s, that's not appropriate anymore. The theatre sort of works more as a refracting art form sometimes than a literal one.
I think Joan would have loved that, what you did, because she went to Clyde and would have been in uniforms, I mean slightly different uniforms, but also I was just thinking about her obsession with time, or her refusal to be obsessed by time. Time Without Clocks was a book she wrote, and everything that was present in your adaptation, I thought, really underlined, was fed by that idea, whether you did it consciously or not. But I think she would have really appreciated
I think it's a key point. I think, and Janelle's written about this, about the way this ongoing claim of Lindsay's, her ability to stop time and her ability to manipulate the implements of time, the clocks, the watches, any device within her purview. She's effectively suggesting that surrounding herself is a force field that can move and defy Einsteinian or Newtonian physics and enter into some kind of Einsteinian universe. And I feel that's how the novel works, and I certainly feel that's something that happens on that Valentine's Day, is that one of of the readings, and by no means a definitive one of the readings is that we're going through one of those processes where Newtonian time and physics no longer apply, and that there are fields of influence, and she hints at that when all of the characters' watches apparently are stopped and Mr. Hussey can't get his watch to work and so on. And the signs, when you look for them, are quite sort of clearly there. But she, in turn, Mulberry Hill and so on, had that same sort of aspect to it, that if you aren't prepared to enter into the spirit of a defiance of time and a sense of the eternity telescoping, the novel will just end up becoming a fairly banal late 20th century novel. But when you read it in terms of the magnificence of time and the way in which white people coming into contact with an ancient continent has caused a crisis of time in all of our imaginations, at that point it becomes a magnificent book. And that's where I started. I love the idea that if you ask a volcanologist about it, they say, well, Hanging Rock, strictly speaking, is a particular type of volcanic plug called a mamelon, which comes from the Latin stem word meaning a nipple. And so there's this idea in some ways that Mother Earth is one of her feeding places, is rising up from the basalt that penetrates many hundreds of kilometres deep under Victoria. And that's why I started the play with a brief coda, a non-Lindsay coda at the front, just pointing out that for most of what we know of Victoria's history, we've floated upon a sea of lava, and most of what constitutes Victoria is a lava plain. And at any moment now, Lake Corangamite or someone else may well erupt, because effectively this volcanic field is still alive. We don't live on a static stage, we live on a liquid one. And I feel that's a very Lindsay-esque offering.
She believed time was a circular motion, that it wasn't a linear motion. She believed that it was like what many of the Indigenous Australians believe, that it was all around us. And she also felt, not only that, she also felt that you could go back in time, and she claimed to have gone back in time. She said that time, or a lot of people have said since then, and perhaps they were quoting her, that time is like a floor plan of a house, that you go through the hall and into the living room, into the sitting room, into the parlour, and you may have left the hall, but it's still there behind you. So theoretically, you could go back. And quantum physics, I had to study a lot of quantum physics for my biography, because Joan was very into mathematics and quantum physics and time, and I had to suddenly grasp all of these concepts that I'd failed maths in school. It was very hard for me. Quantum physicists have just started to learn about a lot of this now. They're just starting to catch up. But Joan was obsessed with mathematics and time, and she used to cut out, Rick Moore, who was an artist who lived with her, said she used to cut out articles in the paper about it all the time. And and there's lots of stories of people that she's told, and they've told me about how she would go back into time. There's a story about a burning nun that Joan tells. She saw a nun walking through a field and it was burning, and she said to Dale, "Did you see that?" And he said no. And they later got to Dale's parents' house, and they said there'd been a convent there, but it had burned down. So she could see things in the landscape, and time was a part of that fascination.
And we sort of touched this before, but allegedly she could stop clocks.
Well, can I just say that we had a book launch for my biography a couple of weeks ago, and quite a lot of people, one of them I think is here tonight, but a few people as well, said that their Instagrams didn't work and their phones didn't work. And I mean, you couldn't make it up.
Legend
you really
lives
couldn't make it up. But even Hanging Rock has its own sense of time. I don't know if you two have felt this, but when I went up a few years ago to do a bit of research, my partner stayed in the car, and I said it was only going to be half an hour. I thought I could just climb the rock quickly. And I was 3.5 hours later, and he said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "But I've only been gone 40 minutes. He said, "You've got no idea how long you've been." So it's Hanging Rock itself, don't you think? Time sort of stands still there a bit, I think.
Well, it does raise the question of why Hanging Rock, doesn't it, as opposed to any other place? Why, as opposed to the Grampians? We know for biographical reasons why, but there are other things as well. It's that there are still flutes that penetrate deep into the substructure. It is a portal. And she evokes that without
field.
Without emphasising it. You have that sense is that it is possible theoretically to plunge from existence there. It is a door, and like the opening lines of Dante, it has that evocative quality, and I think that's sort of the place has a sensibility to it that it existed before white people came, but we've refracted, as I said before, and added to, created our own version.
I remember just being quite dumbstruck when we first went there and started to work, looking at certain of the rocks, the faces, and they're Aboriginal faces. Well, maybe you project that onto them, who knows, but that just seemed so absolutely right that was the case.
No matter what your background, I think everyone can sense that it's a very significant site. There are a lot of legends about how this book was actually written. I've heard that it came to Joan in a series of dreams. Is that correct, Janelle?
It did. She wrote it in 2 weeks.
2 weeks?
Yes, which would be a great talent to have, I think, wouldn't it? But she had had the story in her mind for a long, long time. And she used the word obsessed. She'd been obsessed with Hanging Rock since she was very, very young. When she first went there when she was 4 in the year 1900, which is why she set the novel that year, because it was the first year she'd been to Hanging Rock and she had a profound experience when they went on a picnic there. When she was an adult, she became more and more obsessed with it. And she used that word. And she just wasn't sure how to write a book. She also wanted to write a book about Australia as well. So, and I can relate to that. You're not quite sure what you want to write. You just know you want to write something. But it was the dreams that crystallised this plot. And she dreamed the plot sequentially. So it came to her, the chapters came to her every night, which was extraordinary, really. And someone at the ABC interview asked me that today, if it was a spiritual thing or mystical thing. Well, I can't talk for Joan and I wouldn't dare, but who knows where. A lot of people talk about, especially creative people, we talk about things coming to us and we don't know where they come from, and we're just grateful. So I think she certainly dreamed it, and her housekeeper verified that, Mrs. Clements, who I spoke to, and said she would come down in the morning and she would talk about the French teacher and how she loved the French teacher, and she would talk about Miranda, and she would talk about she loved Sarah. She really thought Sarah was a very pivotal character in the book, and Sarah's brother Albert. And she would say, poor little Sarah, poor little Sarah. So those characters meant a great deal to her.
Look, I hate to bring it up, but then there's the mysterious missing chapter that was published a few years after her death. Could you talk a little bit about...
There was a final chapter, and it was very different to the rest of the book. Would you two agree with that?
Yes, I'd love to hear your opinions, your genuine opinions on who wrote it.
It's very different. It's strikingly different to the rest of the book. It's very esoteric, doesn't it? It sort of goes off into a spiritual realm, and whatever you think about it, and I'm not here to give an opinion, I think it was the right decision to excise it. Would you two agree?
Yes.
But some people think it should have been left in. So what does that mean?
No, I don't. It's just I did find it fascinating to read, and what I liked about it most, what I enjoyed about it, was the section where this clown-like figure, who turns out to be Miss McCraw, that's what you end up thinking, turns into a crab and goes into the landscape, and it's just very weird how Miss McCraw and Miranda and Marion sort of, I don't know what the word is, they just shapeshift. But it's fascinating that they engage with a kind of insect life. And I found that really fascinating. Also, there's a lot of talk about mathematics and Ouspensky and the fourth dimension. And
the number 3. The number 3 is very prominent, and that's for a reason in the book. I spoke with the editor of the book, Sandra Forbes, who's still around. She's in Sydney. She went on to a stellar career at the Australia Council. And she said what happened is that Joan Lindsay, they made a unanimous decision to excise this chapter, but she couldn't bear to part with certain paragraphs. So a lot of the paragraphs from the final chapter were reinserted into chapter 3, but they didn't make sense. So if you read chapter 3 and you think it doesn't make sense, that's why. There's a little bit about the red smoke, or the smoke, which is to do with the search party. The red cloud, which is to do with the search party at the end of the book. But when that red cloud was reinserted into chapter 3, people are thinking, what's going on? Well, red cloud is, if you sort of research a bit into time, red cloud is a symbol that you're about to go through time. So people, particularly uni students, started to think, my gosh, what's going on here with this red cloud? But it was just a typo. It was really just an editorial decision. And Joan probably put her foot down and said, no, I want that in there.
I just don't believe it, because with respect to Sandra and so on, I just don't believe it, because that moment in chapter 3 where the red cloud is revealed is beautifully constructed and beautifully placed, because at that very moment when she says Emma observes the cloud, a new piece of information comes in at exactly that moment and means that they move on, they forget to acknowledge it.
Well, that's clever.
Yeah, it is. It's a superb piece of writing. I'm very dubious about, again, some of the mythology, just purely as a reader. When you read it, it's a much more knowing book than perhaps we're giving the impression of. I think we'd be doing the novel a disservice to make it sound like it was all just sort of automatically written. There's a great deal of craft in it as well.
Joan put a lot in it that people haven't realised.
Yeah.
And he's just picked up on something as well that I didn't even realise. But perhaps that's why she put her foot down. And Sandra told me that Joan was very adamant that things were going to go in certain places. And Joan was quite a strong, even though she was shy, she was quite a strong figure. You know, she was quite well known in Melbourne. And Sandra said they had a lot of talks about what was going to go where, and also the grammar and the punctuation was a big bone of contention, I think, too. But I think there's a lot that Joan put in it that we're still understanding.
How on earth would I know? I'm a complete ignoramus as well. It's based purely on the position of reader. But to me, the so-called missing chapter doesn't ring true. I'm not saying it's not authentic or anything like that, although I do sometimes in my more cynical moments begin to wonder who actually wrote it. It's just more that kind of reductive providing a solution seems to be almost antithetical to everything else that's been established about this entire novel. The novel is a sequence of endless open questions about what it is to be Australian, black, white, in the future, in the past, to inhabit this ancient landscape, to know nature, to not know nature. The questions are endless and they relate to 2,000 years of philosophy. And then to suddenly reduce it down to corsets hanging frozen in the air and a whole sequence of what feels to me very reductionist moments, I can understand completely why the editors just...
That is a wonderful image, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
It is. I'm with you, Helen. I'm glad it exists. I'd be horrified if in some Max Brod style someone decided to burn it. I'm glad it exists. But for me, it doesn't add anything. The novel is perfect in its 1967 form for me.
I agree with you.
The way in which that rock, that trachyte, is in Lindsay's imagination suddenly porous and soft and like marshmallow that can absorb them. These portals or doorways open up and they're almost like hot marshmallow opening, and the girls fold into them, or these creatures fold into them, and you get this image of rock returning to its liquid form. It's all there. It's just we don't need to be told.
No.
At that point, our imaginations have already constructed 4,000 alternatives, and I find the Yvonne Rousseau book that came out in between the two a really interesting exercise in the capacity of readers to take over texts to the point where the reader owns a book and the author is no longer in control of it. Happens to some books, like Wuthering Heights, no longer belongs to poor Emily. It belongs to this body of readers whose imaginations and hearts and souls have colonised it for themselves. And I feel like Hanging Rock is one of the few Australian books that's actually become such texts.
Celebrating the 50th anniversary of Joan Lindsay's picnic at Hanging Rock, Helen Morse, Janelle McCulloch, Tim Wright and Helen Withycombe discussing the troubled history of Hanging Rock, the strange saga of the excise chapter, and what the book means for us today.
And one thing that I hadn't actually realised until I reread it for tonight's event was that it's a work of historical fiction. You know, it was written in the 60s, but it's obviously set in the 1900s. But for some reason, I had just always assumed it was an oldie-timey book.
That's actually a really interesting point, because that is one of those key things. If you have a conversation at a dinner party or a barbecue anywhere, there will be someone who says, "Oh, whatever happened to those girls?" Lindsay's determination with her false little excerpt from The Age at the end of the book to make it feel like it's a documentary text has succeeded, because in spite of all the efforts of people such as us saying, no, it's completely fictional, people still want to believe it. It's become part of the history that we need to have as opposed to the history we actually have. And
it's a work of novel. It's a work of fiction. It's a novel. There's no doubt about that.
But to go to the earlier points, like it's a 1960s postmodernist text. It's not a text of the era of Thomas Hardy and Arnold Bennett, and yet a large part of the readership believe that it actually dates back to that pre-First World War era.
People think that did it happen in 1900, and it's so convoluted, the whole story. And then she wrote the book in the 1960s, but she said it in 1900. So you're sort of jumping back and forth.
It happens all the time through literature, doesn't it? It's like Thackeray wrote books which were set a generation earlier, and so people think he was a contemporary of the Regency era authors, or he was actually a contemporary of Dickens, because at a certain point the texts take over from the author. And this is something that's happened to Lindsay to a certain extent, and because it's such a classical text, we think of it as being a late Victorian or Edwardian book, but it's not. Its sensibility is utterly late 20th century, and it's a book that, that could only be written after Auschwitz in a way, when human beings came under question. I'm surprised that more people don't talk about it, right up there with Christina Stead and Patrick White.
But it's interesting that men love the story. What do you think, Helen? I mean, it's because I would have thought it would be a story that women would really love and take to. Story for everyone, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, I haven't asked a man recently if he's read Picnic at Hanging Rock, but I know that I think almost everyone on the crew and the cast way back then had read the book.
Yeah.
It might be there's something about its muscularity of landscape that we were talking about earlier that means that men who read books in Australia, and let's face it, we're talking about a quite small subsection now, men who read fiction in Australia could probably fit into the Wheeler Centre, you sometimes wonder, but forgive the ungenerousness. But of that maybe there's something about its muscularity and its preparedness to take some serious issues on, whereas trying to find a man who's actually finished The Man Who Loved Children, perhaps the greatest novel written by an Australian, and find there's not that many. I don't know about the sort of sex divide on this one, but certainly from my viewpoint, when I first read it as a teenage boy, I can remember thinking, oh, this one knows what it's doing. When you read a book and you can feel an author who knows what they're doing, and Joan Lindsay knows what she's doing. That's why I love your stuff about 2 weeks. I had no idea she wrote it that quickly. It reminds me of the anecdote about Noel Coward, who wrote Private Lives in a weekend. But of course he hadn't written it in a weekend. He'd been thinking about it for 3 years.
Which is what Joan did, I think.
Apparently she used to sit in her room with paper all around her, a sort of circle, a magic circle.
And she wrote by hand too. She always wrote with a purple pen. Purple was her favourite colour because there was a mulberry tree in the back of their garden, which Mulberry Hill was named after. And purple was, she was very superstitious, again, perhaps to do with the spirituality, how she was quite spiritual, but she always wrote in a purple pen first, and then she typed it all up. But I found her original manuscript, it's almost the same as which is unheard of. I mean, I'm sure many of you are in publishing here. It's unheard of for a manuscript to be sent to a publisher and to be barely changed, apart from the last chapter.
But there was something else that was cut out as well that you found on your in your research.
Oh, we found her original foreword for Picnic at Hanging Rock. It's only about 3 paragraphs long. It's very, very short, so it obviously meant a great deal to her. But the last paragraph she wrote for the author, who knew Hanging Rock and Mount Macedon very well as a child, this story is entirely true. And she didn't just write true, she wrote entirely true, which is very strange. In fact, the whole thing's very strange to put that in a foreword where there's only about 3 paragraphs. And it's a work of fiction. I mean, to all intents and purposes, this was a novel. And the publisher has red-penned it out. She was told not to talk about it again. Or I don't know that it was quite explicit, but they made it ambiguous because...
As theologians and actors know, there's a great deal of difference between fact and truth.
Yes.
And she's only claiming truth. Yes. I think she's entitled to.
But I found a letter from Sandra Forbes, who was the original editor to Joan, and it says, and this was right at the start when Joan had submitted her manuscript for consideration. She didn't even have a contract then or a publishing deal. And Sandra Forbes wrote back to her and said, we really like this, we would like to publish it, but it's interesting that it does seem to be a true story, and I don't know whether that's come from Joan and Joan's correspondence, but Sandra Forbes has written, but we would like to make it a lot more ambiguous. So right from the start, there was this intent to make it ambiguous, which has obviously worked.
Yes, well, clearly. Do you think it matters whether it's true or
No, not
or
at all. In fact, if we knew what it was all about, we wouldn't be still here 50 years later, would we?
She said herself, didn't she?
Yes.
Whether it is fact or fiction.
Doesn't matter.
And on one level it is fact, not just true. It's definitely true, but it is fact as well, in the sense that one of the great anxieties of colonial Victorian experience in this part of the world and elsewhere in Australia was about the way in which children didn't just die in the landscape, but they were completely annihilated by it. Is that you could have your toddler could leave the farmyard or the kitchen garden and wander into the bush, and it's not like back in the old country where the body would be found a day later down a well. They would just disappear because the vastness of the landscape and the nature of the terrain meant that you could lose sight of the things that kept you civilised very, very quickly. And there were books written about this. But we know that this is a major part of our mythic subculture. You look at McCubbin's painting The Lost Child, or the way in which, and we know that Lindsay was very influenced, she studied under McCubbin, as you say, these images of childhood representing all of our innocence in the face of something profound and bigger than us, a much bigger and wiser parent. We are all that McCubbin child or that Lindsay schoolgirl. And our great anxiety and our great fear is that we won't just be overwhelmed by the landscape, but that we will actually be genuinely wiped out. And I use that term advisedly. That's the cultural fear I'm talking about. I think it's just sorry for monopolising it, but it's It's very interesting that we don't actually know the Kulin people's name for Hanging Rock, or at least I haven't.
Yes, I found that interesting.
I haven't in my research been able to find it.
No,
we know
nor have I.
Mount Macedon was Gebur, and we know the name for the Camp Haspi was Yakhal and so on. We know names for many of the places in that part of the world, very sacred places, but this, which was clearly one of the most sacred places, no one has sought to remembered or sought or was able to write down. And so to a certain extent, Picnic at Hanging Rock is an act of mourning on behalf of all Australians for a sense of communion with landscape and between peoples that is no longer possible.
It's interesting that it is such an Australian story, but it resonated incredibly with international audiences, which I find really surprising. How did you find that it was received overseas, Helen, after the film?
I think it went to the Cannes Film Festival, and then I think it opened in London, after its success in Australia. And it just took off, yes.
But it took a while to take off in America, didn't it? Because they didn't understand the fact that it wasn't sold.
I don't know, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. Peter Weir said they couldn't get a distributor in America because Americans didn't understand the fact that it was an open-ended story. They wanted to know what happened. And some distributor threw the book across the room at Peter Weir and said, "What happened to the?"
They should have just waited. There was the final chapter.
But then it took off in America, and it's taught in schools in America, and it's huge in America. Sofia Coppola cited it as an influence on the Virgin Suicides.
It's so clear, isn't it?
I mean, even in England, to the fact that Alexander McQueen used it as an influence on his most seminal collection, that was his Picnic at Hanging Rock collection, that was cited in many of his obituaries. Ralph Simmons, when he was head designer at Christian Dior, cited it as an influence. It's very big in France as well. The scriptwriter said that whenever he goes to Hollywood, people just bow down to him. They go, "Picnic at Hanging Rock." And he could have really made a big name for himself in Hollywood, much as John Searle has done and Peter Weir and many others. But he wanted to come back to Australia and live in Australia, which is applaudable.
Did you have a sense when you were making the film, Helen, that it would be a classic? Was there any kind of, magic?
No, I don't. I certainly didn't. I don't think anybody thought in those terms. We were just in this kind of what became a kind of radiant world of making the film and learning too, because we were all very young, and I don't think anybody had really done very much film work. So we were all learning, including the great Russell Boyd, who was the cinematographer. And John Seal, you mentioned, was the camera operator. And, gaffer like Tony Tegg, and it was a fantastic crew and cast. I know that there was probably a certain point where you I certainly became aware that I was involved in a process that was like being part of a work of art. I don't want to sound pretentious, and I certainly didn't have tickets on myself, but I think it was just to do with the extraordinary group of people who were learning and making. And, people like Martin Sharp was involved to an incredible degree. I mean, I remember like a little tiny story about Martin, who was obsessed with the book. And before we started filming, he gave, I think, almost every woman on the set, I don't know how he'd transported them, paintings of the Botticelli Venus or variations on that theme, quite a few of them being sort of Victoriana, sepia-toned sort of, no pubic hair, but, standing on shells. Beautiful, surrounded by cherubs, There was a scene I shot towards the end of our time in South Australia with Rachel Roberts, who played Mrs. Appleyard. And it's after Sarah has seemingly disappeared, and nobody has found out what happened to her. And it's a dinner to which Mademoiselle's been invited, and Madame Appleyard is somewhat inebriated. And we sort of set up, we'd done the dry run, and we were just about to do a take. And Martin just said, he was all over the film in terms of its visuals. And he was involved in props. He worked with the art director, David Copping, and with the main props man, Graham Gracie Walker, as he was known to everybody. And he just placed a little vase just kind of between Rachel Roberts and myself on the table, which was, beautifully laid out with silver and everything, plates, with pansies. And pansies were Sarah's flower.
And Joan's
Albert
favourite
talks
flower.
about it.
They were Joan's as well.
Oh, was that? I didn't know that was her favourite flower. And it was just Martin's understanding of the scene, and just to have that there was just an extra, like, beautiful kind of connection for everyone involved in the moment, which included the entire crew who were there.
But pansies also, in the old language of flowers, mean memory and remembrance.
Yes.
And so that was pertinent to Sarah.
We were talking about the story's international appeal. Now, Tom, you have toured this play.
Yes, the Melbourne production of Picnic at Hanging Rock, and it's a theatrical realisation. It's not a definitive treatment in the way that the film is, just the nature of theatre. Went to Edinburgh early this year. It was very interesting to put it in front of an audience of Scots, because this is Scotland in between having narrowly voted down their right to independence, but also the Brexit vote sort of sitting very closely in their minds. So an audience of sort of educated Scots in Edinburgh. It was interesting to hear how they viewed it as a text about Englishness, and about the way Englishness isn't just a state of being English, but is also an ideology that is imposed upon people. The foyer conversations tended to skip over perhaps what we might see as its more essentially Australian qualities, and they universalised it to be a piece about the way in which colonisation takes place in the form of education. And so for them, the idea of a school as an institution whereby power structures are reenacted and where Englishness is imposed upon people whether they want it or not was very interesting to me. And what has been intriguing is that production's now been picked up, and it's going to be in London at the Barbican Centre next year. And it's very rare for a work of Australian performing arts that isn't of Indigenous thematics these days to tour. So we're very gratified by that, and there's been invitations from all sorts of cities and venues across Western Europe, and yet none here at home. And it is interesting. And I won't name this person, but one cultural impresario or arts gatekeeper described the story as being too white. And he didn't mean I've already given away 50% of the prospects, but didn't mean to suggest that it's just an issue of white versus black. It's an issue of its cultural sensibility, is that there's a certain unfashionability now about some of our core texts and about canonical texts and things like that. So I think I might have erred in some way. I feel like I'm on the wrong side of fashion with this one.
But I don't think it was ever meant to be a white story. I think it was a portrait of Australian landscape more than because Joan was an artist before she became a writer. So as Helen was saying backstage, it has a beautiful painterly quality, doesn't it? Even both the film and the book have this painterly quality. So to me, it's a portrait of Australia rather than this or that or whatever, and so it's surprising that this gentleman is kind of...
I should be quite clear. What happens is that certain texts, the faces are all of Anne and all of the cast who played the girls and so on in their white. It becomes like an exercise in whiteness, and now in this age of a far more sophisticated and cosmopolitan view of Australianness, it feels like it's harking back to the generation that many people want to disassociate themselves from. You talk about the importance of 1900 as a year. It is, of course, the year where the liminal space where we leave colonial Australia behind and enter into our so-called nationhood. She's deliberately cited it right there at that moment in our history where our metaphorical childhood ends and our so-called adulthood begins. And for some people, it's a problematic text for that reason.
I particularly wanted to come because I went to Hanging Rock for the first time a few weeks ago. I have never lived in Victoria before. Yes, I mean, I'd like to think that it was perhaps based on fact, but there was all this maybe. But the actual exhibition there, the explanation of Hanging Rock and the book makes out that it is based on fact. And I wondered if this was deliberate, because the words say simply that after this event, things went really badly at the school. One of the teachers, I think it was the headmistress, committed suicide. The students dropped out, and eventually the school closed. And it's written like it actually happens. This is not really a question, more of an observation and why that was done. The other point that I heard was that Aboriginal people don't go there because they consider it's a place full of unfinished business. I wonder if that's true.
Janelle, did you visit the site? Have you seen whether it is in fact portrayed as true?
I have been to Hanging Rock and I did look at that exhibition. I must admit I didn't read that particular part of that exhibition, so I apologise. But as for the second part of your observation about the Indigenous people, there have been groups of Indigenous people who have visited the Rock. There was a group of these tough old Northern Territory Indigenous elders and they got halfway up the rock, and the park ranger told me this, and they just turned on their heels, and he said they literally ran down, got on the bus and closed the door, and they were sort of just looking at him through the glass, and they said, this place is evil, we have to go now, and he doesn't know why they said that. And then there was a group of Maori people who, this park ranger was with them, and they went to the rock, and they had a similar thing. They got halfway up the rock and they kind of closed into a circle and did this protective chant. He doesn't, again, and I don't know either, I'm just telling you the story. But it certainly was, would you agree, significant to the Indigenous Australians?
No doubt, but in ways that we can't possibly seek to discern, and this is the moment where white fellas shut up, isn't it?
Exactly.
But I'm also interested in the idea that Lindsay was very keen to try to eviscerate all evidence of the story, at least in the novel. She talks about how a few years later a fire sweeps down the Macedon Ranges and the entire school is razed to the ground, which actually isn't necessarily what happened. Braemar College is still there, the school which she presumably had in mind. But it was important for her mythic purposes is that she finishes off, she ties up the ends to a certain extent, everything that is associated with this particular real or imagined or certainly true incident is wiped away and the bush just reclaims it.
While the book is fictional, girls did go missing in the area, so there are elements of truth to it, of course.
Well, we just have to explain the elephant in the room. A lot of people think it's based on a true story. It is a novel, and let's state that very clearly. But Joan Lindsay has said in both public and private, in her private archives, that there was a lot more truth to it than people have assumed over the years. There is evidence that girls disappeared in the Victorian Police Gazette, which was an internal police document that was distributed between police stations from 1850 right through until early 1900. But there's not enough evidence. It's a mystery, and it's a beautiful mystery, and I think it's really important to kind of retain some sense of that mystery. So if you're sort of determined to find out if it's true or if it's not true or whatever, I welcome, go to the State Library and spend 3 months like I did going through and having a look, and then go out to Hanging Rock. But really it's not important, because Joan Lindsay's life was extraordinary and this novel is extraordinary, and what everyone's has done with it since is extraordinary. So that's really what's important, not whether it's true or not.
So one of the things that I loved about this book is that there are just themes sort of scattered everywhere. There's themes of sexuality and gender and feminism and class, which Joan was clearly working through, on the page. Would you call it a feminist text?
I don't know.
I'd love to answer that, but as the only man on stage, I feel like I'll be mansplaining, so I might...
I mean, as you brought up before, Tom, all those references to the restrictions of the clothing and, the...
Well, to my male mind, it is patently a feminist text, but also intersects beautifully with class politics, as you allude to, because the more aristocratic, the more educated, the more indoctrinated into the psychology and cult of Victoriana womanhood the characters are, the less likely they are to be accepted by the rock. This is a reading, not of my reading. I'm not saying this is what Lindsay's saying, but if you look at the people who actually disappear on the rock, they are people who have experience with the noumenal, the ability to transcend time and space. So silly Ellen, what's her name, who runs down the... Edith. Silly Edith, who runs down, is so trapped in the world of what her mum says, and girls shouldn't study mathematics. She's prosaic, she's resolute, she's going to survive in Australia, or at least in some form she's going to survive. Irma is worldly and concerned with her tassels and her ribbons. The rock chews her up and then spits her out because she lacks the spiritual dimension or the earthly dimension. But the ones who are taken are mathematicians or nature's aristocrats like Miranda, who are capable to transmogrify into swans and so on. For me, it's really clear that education is being posited in that book, or the idea of becoming a woman is being posited as something unnatural, and that Sarah and the girls that are there are in the process of being rendered into unnatural things. Culture is not necessarily seen as being a positive force, an oppressive thing. And the destiny for Irma is to end up married and a countess and living living out a life, and Mamselle's going to go off and marry her watchmaker and so on. You don't feel like for me, it's not a book of liberation. But having said that, it's not a political feminist text. For me, I'm really interested by the idea of Marion, because the way Marion is established as a character, you feel like Lindsay is saying this is the kind of woman who would go on to become the woman for the nouveau siècle should become the suffragette, go on, become Dame Edith Lyons or something like that in Parliament.
Reputed to have mastered long division in the cradle.
Taken away from us. So I mean feminist in the sense of deeply concerned with what it is to be a woman in society, not in the sense of a construction of a radical program. That's one of the things I love about it. I think that's what's so smart.
That's a really beautiful way of putting it. It is a book, that's why I asked about women and men at the start. It's a book, I think, written about women, for women. Joan had 2 relationships with women, and let's call them Edwardian friendships. They meant a great deal to her, these 2 women, but she couldn't really tell. You know, as I said, she was very discreet, very, very private woman. She loved women. She loved who they were and their creativity and their passion and their spirit, didn't she? And I think a lot of that is in Picnic, isn't it?
Yeah, it comes through.
Well, and the idea of the passionate relationships between women in institutional environments, which she wasn't the only person to write about, but Sarah is constructed as a character that we know because of the backstory with Albert is a foundling, is someone who has this kind of awful images of institution, and she's destined to never grow old. And so there's a certain sadness at work there. And I always think of Lindsay as being part of that generation that experienced the horrific forces of the First World War and the very traumatic psychological impact it had upon women of her generation, many of whom never had husbands simply because the men were taken away. And this idea of people who will never grow old, who will remain trapped in that beautiful, almost mythic time before Gallipoli and the Somme and Passchendaele destroyed all of our innocences, that some of those characters are left there in that pansy field of memory, and some are destined to grow old and be corrupted by the 20th century. It's an elegy for her vanished generation.
And don't forget it was a private girls' school that she was writing about. I mean, if any of you I went to a girls' school, and girls, you know, when they all together, the emotions are heightened. So it really wasn't...
I did too.
Yes. So, I mean, my school was very much like the Clyde or the school that was depicted in albeit without the headmistress and without the disappearances. But it's a story about this girls' school as much as anything, isn't it?
What's the presiding spirit of that girls' school? Is that big statue of Venus sitting over the stairwell there. She makes it quite clear that Aphrodite is the predominant energy, that there's a sexual eroticism at work all the way through it. And
Martin Sharp thought it very much was about the birth of Venus in Australia.
Wow.
Partly,
Yeah.
yes. And also just about Sarah, she wants to write her own work, and she's pounced on by, almost sat on, in every way.
Well, Mrs. Appleyard represents that, doesn't that oppressive sort of... what the galleon image you were talking about earlier?
Yes, I think there's one reference to her.
And she's buttoned up with a cameo and so on. It's all
her stays are absolutely rigid.
And she's there enforcing that you will learn your Longfellow and you will learn your Felicia Hemans, the greatest English literature that young ladies can learn, and Sarah wants to write her own odes, the nationalist yearning.
In some ways, it's also about the birth of an artwork from Joan Lindsay, an Australian artwork. I'm not putting it very well, but you know what I mean.
No, you are.
What I mean.
It's an artwork that has stayed with us for 50 years, and I'm so glad that you were able to help us celebrate it tonight. Thank you all so much for coming. Please give our panellists a warm round of applause.
Picnic at Hanging Rock, an Australian classic, turns 50. On the panel at the Wheeler Centre were actress Helen Morse, Lindsay biographer Janelle McCulloch, playwright Tom Wright and moderator Helen Withercombe, the programming manager at the Wheeler Centre.